Hello, and thanks for joining us for the Farming Today podcast. I'm Kaz Graham, and in this episode, Cornish fishermen share their fears about plans to restrict the area they're allowed to fish in. And British cheesemakers say they've got a raw deal on export tariffs to the US compared to their EU competitors.
It's going to be very damaging, and I feel a bit let down by the politicians, to be honest. I feel that, we just haven't done a good enough deal. You can't dress it up.
More on that shortly. First, though, if you live in the countryside, it's likely that your local authority gets 40% less funding than an urban one. You will pay 20% more council tax, and it's harder to find a dentist, a doctor, a bank or a bus. And those figures from the Rural Services Network may not come as news to you. We're going to take a look at rural services all this week, and to get the ball rolling, I've been talking to Kerry Booth from the Rural Services Network. I asked her if people in rural areas really do get worse public services than those in cities.
Some of those essentials that people need to live their lives, whether that might be a bank, a post office, a library, we don't have those everywhere within our rural communities, so people can miss out. We hear issues around accessing employment, the lack of transport in some areas is really marked. So that can mean that they might not be able to access new training and skills courses, giving them different opportunities for employment. It might be that they can't access the doctors because there is no bus that will get them there. So that can leave those residents disadvantaged by that.
And can you tell me about housing as well, because housing is another big issue and people don't necessarily think it will be in rural areas.
No, absolutely. We have a real lack of affordable housing in our rural areas. In some of our tourist hotspots, we have large numbers of Airbnb, second homes, which can mean that we don't have those long-term rental properties for our local people to live in those communities.
Can you explain why it's more difficult and expensive to deliver services to rural areas?
We work with local authorities, that's rural local authorities across the country, and they tell us that delivering services is more expensive in rural areas. It's not just the distances travelled. Collecting the bins from a rural area where you've got 2 or 3 miles between properties, that costs more. But also they can struggle to find providers for services. So if they need to provide home care services, actually there may not be a provider locally in a very remote rural area. So they're having to buy in those services from more urban areas, which can cost more.
From a government point of view, it may be argued that there are fewer people living in remote rural parts of the country, lower population densities. Isn't there a logic that focusing on spending on urban areas will benefit more people and it's therefore a better use of money?
I suppose absolutely you're hitting more people if you're spending money in our urban areas, but that doesn't mean that those in our rural communities should miss out. What we saw this year for 25-26 is that urban councils are receiving 40% more per head in government-funded spending power than rural councils. Due to years of underfunding, actually rural councils have had to put up council tax to be able to balance their books. And actually now in rural areas, we're paying on average 20% more in council tax compared to those in our urban areas. So we're paying more for our services and actually receiving less in return.
I know that your organisation, you want government to design policy that specifically meets rural needs and challenges. How would that work?
Firstly, we want government to recognise that there are differences in rural areas and make sure that we're measuring things at the right level. Government talks a lot about the deprivation in our cities, and we can hit high clusters of deprivation by doing certain policies, but we mustn't ignore the fact that we have deprivation in our rural communities too. And yes, there's not high numbers of them, but that doesn't mean that those people aren't important. We know actually we have lots of small and medium-sized enterprises in rural areas. We have lots of sole traders. We want to target economic support to help them to grow their businesses. And it might be that they need more affordable homes in that area for their workforce to have somewhere to live. It might be that they need improved digital connectivity. We just need to make sure we're thinking that there are different circumstances in rural areas and that we target our policy to suit what's happening in those rural communities.
Kerry Booth from the Rural Services Network. Cornish fishermen, fearful for the future of their industry, are hoping to meet with the new Environment Secretary to share their concerns. The government is consulting on extending a ban on bottom trawler fishing in marine protected areas. Conservationists argue the practice of dragging nets and chains along the sea floor is destroying habitats and species. But fishermen are warning that restricting where they can catch will cause financial hardship. Here's BBC Radio Cornwall's political reporter Seb Noble.
You might have noticed it's the time of year when things are beginning to change. And it's not just the seasons. Last week's cabinet reshuffle saw Emma Reynolds take over as the government's new Environment Secretary. And that comes at a crucial time for the future of the fishing industry. A consultation is currently taking place on extending a ban on a controversial practice known as bottom trawler fishing. It's basically using a large net and dragging it across the seabed to catch things. It's practiced by some of the fishermen who operate out of harbours, including Newlyn. Well, Cornwall's fishermen say the proposed restrictions would be devastating and hope a new person at the top may listen. Chris Ranford's chief executive of the Cornish Fish Producers Organisation.
They're also looking at potting and netting, two very important fishing methods in the southwest and around the country. So if the proposals are to go forward as they are, then yes, it will have huge economic impact on the fishing industry. The door is always open in Cornwall to help people understand the fishing industry, whoever it is. We certainly welcome a visit. Perhaps new people, new faces, a clean slate could be a good thing.
Well, the proposed ban would cover almost all of 40 marine protected areas. They're parts of the sea designated for conserving species and habitats. But fishermen here argue the nets they use are less harmful and they often avoid such areas already. And Chris is hoping the government takes a different approach.
There's not a question of about being able to go everywhere and do anything they want. It's a case of let's get the best evidence possible. If there's no evidence to say that there's no problem or no interaction or no issue, then they should be allowed to continue to fish there. If there is good evidence to say that it should stop and it's causing damage, okay, we can understand that and accept that. But ultimately, we want a zonal-based approach.
However, conservationists are adamant that wouldn't work. Charles Clovers, the co-founder of the Blue Marine Foundation, who campaign for protecting our oceans.
So this idea of you can go and fish this bit, not that bit, because it's not important, it's not scientifically necessary, it's just wrong. You need to protect the area that has been designated. It's been designated after years of consultation for a good reason. Just protect it from bottom trawling if bottom trawling is damaging to the species that you're trying to protect. End of.
Well, the government insists restoring oceans to good health's essential for both nature and fishing businesses. And this consultation's been extended until the end of the month as they cast their net wider for responses. But can they find a compromise to satisfy all sides?
That's BBC Radio Cornwall's political reporter Seb Noble. Now, let's hope Donald Trump enjoys the cheese course at the traditional state banquet he'll be served up during his visit to the UK later this week. Who knows, he could be persuaded to lower the tariff that British cheesemakers are having to fork out when they export to the US, which is higher than that paid by their EU competitors. Dairy sector representatives say it is damaging the industry. On the face of it, it looks like the UK has the best deal. 10% tariffs on exports to the US compared to the 15% that the EU negotiated. But while that 10% is all many exporters will pay, some products like steel and cheese have additional pre-existing tariffs too, so those selling them can end up paying far more. Ireland is a big exporter of cheese, and some farmers fear that with lower tariffs, it now has a significant trading advantage. Rich Clothier is the managing director of Wyke Farms, a family business that's been making cheese for 4 generations.
The EU have been quite clever in the negotiation because actually they've negotiated an all-in tariff. Now, what that means is that any of the recent additions under the Trump administration aren't added to the existing tariffs, which actually is the case for the UK. So although we only had a 10% addition to start with, and it appeared that we had a relatively good deal, if you then add that to the current levy, we'll end up paying a levy somewhere in the region of about 10% more than the EU, which is quite worrying for UK cheesemakers and quite worrying for our customers, the other end. And it gives us a position where we're not as competitive as some of our EU competition.
How important is the US market for British cheesemakers?
It's really significant, and I think 10% probably doesn't sound very much to people listening to the interview, but what it means, it affects our ability to promote our products in the same way that the EU producers would be. So ultimately, it'll make us more expensive in the markets. Now, I believe that we make the best cheese in the world, but it still means that we're going to have to charge customers more, and other cheeses from the EU could be cheaper than ours, which is a challenge.
Donald Trump is visiting the UK this week. There may well be some trade talks. Do you think trade ministers should be trying to get a new deal for dairy products in the light of that EU deal?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think we should be looking at, the access we give to the UK market. The UK market is one of the most attractive consumer markets in the world. And I think in some of the trade deals that the government have been doing, they've been giving that up too easily. And it was one of my real concerns about Brexit. I always felt concerned that UK agriculture and food producers could be sold out in preference to other more fashionable manufacturing bases, such as car manufacture, etc.
And how serious do you think the impact of this higher rate of tariff for UK producers rather than EU producers is going to be on the cheese industry?
Oh, it's going to be very damaging, and at a time when we should be growing in the biggest consumer market in the world, we're going to be weighed down by, a pretty poor deal. And I feel a bit let down by the politicians, to be honest. I feel that, we just haven't done a good enough deal. You can't dress it up.
That's Rich Clothier from Wyke Farms. Well, we asked the Department for Business and Trade for a response, but they didn't get back to us in time. However, in a previous statement, they said the UK's landmark trade deal is the result of a pragmatic approach to working with the US. And that's all from us for today. I'm Kaz Graham. The producer is Beatrice Fenton. And Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.